guys? Welcome back to the Daily Dish. I'm your host, Christian Royston, joined by my co-host, Logan Shanks. We've got an action-packed day for men's basketball. Obviously, they just got back from their road trip to Texas. Kind of a mixed bag of emotions there. Some pretty high highs, pretty low lows, but we're also going to look ahead to TCU after that. But we can start with Baylor. Of course, that's, kind of a heartbreaking loss in a way. Especially what it came down to, that buzzer beater at the end. But I think the whole game just kind of showed just where Iowa State kind of struggles but also excels.
Yeah, and you could kind of tell throughout the game that Iowa State did not have the makeup to win that game. They weren't, they weren't playing the way that, it feels weird because with that Baylor game being, we now think of it as so long ago, and, the win over Texas kind of overshadows how close that game really was against Baylor. Like you said, came down to the last second with the Milan 3, but really, Iowa State should not really have been in that position. And we can go in depth about, their Scott Drew getting tossed, leading to an Iowa State 20-point run. And I wrote about it, and I think it was a column or whatever it was, that normally when Iowa State goes on a 20-point run, should win those. Any team should really win a game when they score 20 points and allow 0 points on a run. But they just they don't play like that the same way on the road, and it just wasn't really their game to win, honestly.
Yeah, and they go on a 20-point run. You would assume that you do that, you're up by double figures. Yeah. They did that to retake the lead.
By 2 or 3, whatever it was.
I think they were up by maybe 5 at a point, which isn't where you want to be after a 20-point run, especially just with everything that was going on. You can say what you want about the refs. Obviously, I don't know if you saw afterwards, the Baylor AD kind of went all in on the refs, said that they didn't really live up to the standards that the Big 12 should have, and it was a very poor day for them, which I get that. There were quite a few calls that did go Iowa State's way, and you see Scott Drew get tossed, which I think that's the first time he's ever been tossed. But still, the hole that they dug themselves into before, just off of pretty much sloppy play, what they usually tend to struggle with, it all kind of came out in that first half. It almost seemed like they weren't deserving of a win.
No, yeah. Point. And that's what I was kind of alluding to, is that with the way that they played, and you could kind of see it at the end of the game, if that shot by Milan does, go in, you think that, Iowa State literally has to be the definition of escaping a game, where you don't really play the whole game like you're meant to be in it. You only really go on a run because Baylor's shaken up. They just got their coach tossed. But overall, when Keyshawn had a great game offensively. That's about it, really. You could just really tell that they couldn't get into their normal offense, and their defense was fine throughout the game. I would say, it just sucks to see that they have really not adapted to letting up open threes, at least against Baylor. So,
and you look at the numbers. It seemed like, before the Kansas game, of course, we were expecting Iowa State to, I think they shot 5 for 14, which is about on par with what Iowa State's been shooting. But then, again, you let your opponent have almost as many 3-point makes as you have attempts. That is just a kind of a gap there that you can't have in the Big 12, because, obviously you're letting up that many 3-pointers. They're going to score more points than you. That's just how it is. Yeah. And obviously Milan, before he when we talked to him, he said that, they wanted to attempt more because obviously they weren't shooting a lot. But, it also seems like they need to keep their opponents from attempting a lot. Because, if you put up 30 shots, you're probably going to hit 12 to 15 of them. And you hit those, that's what Baylor did, and you're going to amass a pretty big lead.
Yeah, and I think what kind of goes along with that is, we've talked a lot about, when Iowa State loses, it's because they can't get into their offense, and their offense, as we know, is created off forcing turnovers. Well, I feel like a lot of their turnovers come, whether it's in the paint, not really outside the arc. So they leave a lot of shooters open. When when their main emphasis is trying to get turnovers in the paint, then that leads to, guys getting double teamed inside, and Then, Baylor obviously has, worked that out, that they, kick the ball out. There's been other teams that have figured that out in Big 12 play against the Cyclones. And, we're talking like really negative, like they lost by like 15. it was a really close game, yeah. But just for them to perform like that, it was kind of disheartening for a little bit. You kind of thought, all right, well, same narrative. Iowa State can't really win on the road. They're letting up open threes. When they can't get into their offense early on, they're kind of doomed. But overall, now in retrospective, you can kind of look at the Baylor game as that's just a good team in Baylor who had been, a lot of people went into it thinking that Iowa State was just going to dog on them because Baylor before they were 1-3 in their last 4 games, I think so. So
they've been kind of like plummeting through the rankings.
Yeah, so you kind of thought that, Baylor's not really a top dog, but that was just as much of a game where Baylor just came back from kind of what, I'll just say it, not great officiating, and getting their coach toss, whatnot. They just that was more of a great game for them than it was Iowa State, being really bad.
Yeah, and I kind of want to, before I stop dogging on Iowa State a little bit, I kind of want to go back to what you said about leaving the wide open shooters. I mean, Iowa State has kind of hung their hat on forcing turnovers, and that's their big part of their defense and why it's so hard to play against them. Mm-hmm. But I mean, they're really good at forcing turnovers because they double team on the edge. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think we were talking about it during the Baylor game. I know that the commentators were probably talking about it against Texas too. Iowa State will send like 2 guys to guard somebody, and I mean, a lot of times you're forcing pressure. They're going to make a mistake with the ball, or it's going to get poked out or whatnot. But I mean, what Baylor and other teams have figured out is if you move the ball around and you have Iowa State forcing these double teams, somebody's going to be open. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that's just kind of where the wide open shots come from. That's what we saw against Baylor early on is they weren't quick enough off the double teams to actually guard the shooters, and shots were falling. But and we can go into just kind of, it was, I guess, tough for Baylor to see like their coach get tossed. I mean, that's a guy who doesn't usually get tossed,
yeah,
doesn't usually get teased.
Yeah.
But, I mean, the emphasis this year for the Big 12 referee staff has been you have to call the techs on people that are way out of position. Mm-hmm. And if you stay in your coaching box, kind of like what TJ was saying to us, if you stay in your coaching box, you're going to have no problems. But if you're on the court, you're in a play, if I'm going to actually pass you the ball, you're a little bit too far.
Yeah. No, he definitely deserved his technicals. It was just kind of, I would say the first one for sure. I mean, he was literally on the 3-point line. And then the second one, I mean, if you're going by the book, he was outside his box, probably said something to the ref that the ref didn't like, and he gets tossed. And I just keep going back to Baylor just really being able to rebound off that instead of, letting Iowa State just dog on him, because it almost was a similar situation to, and this is different because Jerome Tang didn't get tossed, but kind of like it was the same scenario when Jerome Tang got his technical in the Kansas State game, and then he and Kansas State, they just had a complete collapse for the rest of the game, which is why I think Iowa State ultimately pulled away. Yeah. I think even with Baylor, Drew getting tossed, I think they just, like I said, rebounded really well from that. And Iowa State ultimately, I feel like they took what didn't work in their defensive scheme, I guess, against Baylor into Texas, kind of ironed it out a little bit more. And that's all kind of what you really want to see, is that you're not just doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Mm-hmm. So I think Iowa State cleaned up pretty well defensively against Texas.
Yeah. And I mean, I kind of feel like, I thought they wouldn't have that momentum coming off the Baylor game. You talk about Baylor coming back from kind of tough scenarios, and not only getting your coach tossed, but getting the bench, getting a technical immediately after. So Iowa State's just getting a lot of free points. Mm-hmm. But I mean, it really did come down to like the last few seconds there. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think Lipsy was the one who actually scored first, put the Cyclones ahead with 2 seconds or 4 seconds, I want to say. And you're like, oh, that's got to be the game winner. Mm-hmm. And then you have, I want to say his name is Nunn on the other end.
I think so, yeah.
And he gets the and one. Obviously doesn't hit the free throw, but doesn't need to.
Yeah.
and then you set up just a 1 second shot for Milan that just can't go. I mean, could you ask for like a even more of a roller coaster there at the end? I know I was up and down out of my chair the entire time.
I didn't know what to write. I didn't know whether Iowa State was going to pull away, whether, Baylor was going to keep up there. I mean, I think it was, Taman scored. There was like 14 seconds left. Yeah. And Baylor goes the length of the court, puts the ball in, gets the foul. Trey King, I mean, he tries to not foul. I mean, you could obviously tell Iowa State was, obviously not trying to foul them. Yeah. But Baylor was looking for it. They got it. And just a miracle shot from Milan that goes in. And a lot of people are saying, if only he had a tenth of a second more. I think probably need a couple more.
If he had 1.5 seconds on the clock.
I would say so. But, you can't say if he had a tenth of a second long. I mean, like, he still kind of had the ball, like, in his shooting form when, the buzzer hit zero. Or the clock hit zero. Buzzers don't hit zeros. But
they hit red.
They hit red.
Yeah. But, he's a freshman. We forget that he's a freshman, and he hits the shot against Houston to win. He almost hits that shot against Baylor. I mean, he just has this clutch gene in him that should be good going forward. And, he didn't hit it this time, but just having the confidence to hit that shot and take whatever shot he wants should be, a good sign going forward that if he does need to hit a buzzer beater, especially when we get to tournament time, he's the guy that's probably going to hit it.
And it's weird that he, hits those shots in the big time, but like it almost seems like there's moments in the game, in almost any game in Big 12 play, and it's just a freshman adjusting. I completely understand that, but where they can't really find him a shot.
Yeah.
Like I don't really think one thing that I've kind of criticized Iowa State, not on this podcast, but I've kind of criticized them for is that they don't really find shots or create shots for Milan. It's almost like he has to do it himself, which kind of sucks because when you have a shooter that great, limiting him to like doing, getting shots off the dribble, stuff like that, where he has to, like I said, kind of create his own shot is weird, but he stepped up a little bit more against Texas, really, where he found those shots more consistently. We'll talk more about that, but like what obviously stands out is his fadeaway at the top of the key, Dirk Nowitzki style. I mean, come on.
He's just got that one on lock.
Yeah.
You see him at that fadeaway, you're like, okay, that's going in for sure.
And it's crazy because like we saw that early, against non-con teams. I'm like, all right, well, I don't know if that's really going to hold up. Yeah. And then he hits that same shot against Houston to win the game, essentially. So
yeah, he's just like. He's really coming to his own, too. And, you talk about not getting shots to him. I think that also kind of plays into these Big 12 defenses. Just, they know who the big threats are, and they know why they're threats. That's kind of why we're seeing Keyshawn and Taman not get to the line as much. They know that they're driving in looking for fouls. They know that Milan's going to pretty much hit anything that is given to him. So, they pretty much just know kind of who to guard and how to guard them. And he does get his shots at times, but it does seem like when they draw plays or when people get open, it's usually not Milan. It's usually like Kurt or Taman and recently Keyshawn, actually.
Yeah. And that's another thing, kind of weird stats that we were talking about before is that Keyshawn hit all 5 of Iowa State's threes against Baylor.
Yeah, which is kind of crazy.
Yeah, and he shot really well. I think he ended up shooting like 5 for 6, 5 for 7, whatever it was. But again, that's just, I guess, a good thing that Iowa State can look at is when they do lose games like that, at least they're not, it kind of sounds weird, but they're losing the same way. They're not losing it. It's like, okay, when Iowa State, if like you were telling me that Iowa State lost a game, I'd be like, all right, probably didn't force a ton of turnovers, didn't shoot the ball well from outside. That's kind of been their 2 bugaboos, as if you want to say that. Shout out Step Brothers. But yeah, when they don't get those 2 right, or at least to like a certain like level, that's when they lose those games.
Yeah, I get that. And you talk about Keyshawn, he hits all 5 of those. It's kind of weird too, just because he's almost like a hot and cold shooter because he started Big 12 play missing 8 straight three-pointers in the span of like 4 games. Yeah. And then he missed all 3 of the ones he took against Texas immediately after Baylor. So, And I think he hits the dagger against Kansas. I mean, he's the guy that can hit the threes when need be, but also can't. But I mean, whatever you got to do to get to 20 points consistently. I mean,
Yeah.
he's just been a beast.
Yeah, I think he's now averaging the most points on the team since Taman's kind of taken that dip. And, we can transition into the Texas game where big thing for me was that I didn't know, so Baylor, they lose the Baylor game. Mm-hmm. They have to stay in Texas and for a couple more days to play Texas on Tuesday. And I predicted them to win, but I wasn't very confident in it, mainly because after looking, I saw that Iowa State had not won in Texas since 2015. And it was, and TJ, they haven't played, or his teams have not played well in the Moody Center, I believe it's called, in his first 2 years. And it was kind of just like a prove it, as in not only can you win on the road, but can you beat Texas on the road? Yeah. And I think they overall in the game played really well outside of like an 8-minute stretch in the second half where they kind of just fell apart a little bit.
Yeah, and unfortunately that 8-minute stretch came like at the end of the second half, which was a little scary. But I mean, you talk about they snapped that 8-game losing streak. I mean, you had the stat, or you brought the stat to me that the last time they beat them, I think they were ranked the exact same.
They were 14th, and Texas was also unranked.
Yeah, so it was almost like it was in the stars for them to beat Texas this time.
But it was, might have been.
Yeah. And you talk about Iowa State snapping this big losing streak, and it was really a team effort. I mean, they allowed that second half fall apart, especially in the last minutes. But it almost seemed like they were fine with that because of how well they did for pretty much the first 30 minutes of that game.
Yeah, I mean, Texas didn't really shoot the ball that well in the first half, and Iowa State, again, kind of like I said, they adjusted their defensive scheme, or at least it was just working against Texas, who was a pretty decent three-point shooting team overall coming into the game. So it kind of surprised me with their shooting in the first half. I mean, Iowa State played great defensively, and, they were getting baskets when they needed to. It all really started on that first play of the game where Taman breaks up, gets pressure on the ball and gets a steal leading into a Milan 3, I want to say.
Yeah.
So you kind of just felt that not only did, and again, that's another thing where, if Iowa State loses a game, it's because they weren't the more aggressive team. Iowa State came out and they were the aggressor in this matchup, and you kind of really saw that in the first half.
And you talk about Milan, I feel like all the newcomers just like went off in that first like I want to say 5-minute stretch. I mean, it was Milan hits the first 5, and then Keyshawn hits the next 2 shots, and then Kurt Jones comes out and hits the next 2 shots. I mean, it was like just all Iowa State, just perfect shooting. I mean, it's almost like you couldn't really ask for a better start to a game. And I mean, you could tell because obviously Iowa State builds up a double-digit lead like right away, almost 20 points.
And, I'll shout out, whenever I get the chance, I'll shout out my guy, Pav, who comes in and although gets 4 fouls, played pretty good defense. And that was something that I asked TJ today is, Pav and Demarion Watson, they're guys where, especially in Big 12 play, they'll either play 12 minutes or 3 minutes. And it's all kind of about what TJ and his staff see to either keep putting him in the game or not. Pav came in there. He, handled the ball really well, played good defensively outside of getting 4 fouls pretty early in the second half.
Yeah.
But, he gets 6 points, and he was hunting those shots and getting into the paint. And I was really impressed with that. Watson gets a dunk in that as well. And that was just really part of Iowa State, taking control in that first half, which surprised me because, like I've said, going into enemy territory, I didn't think, especially how they played against Baylor, they were going to be able to do that.
Yeah, you talk about these like almost these are like the role players on the bench that get kind of varying minutes. I did not expect Pav to come in and really kind of like take over the game there. I mean, he played a lot of meaningful minutes in that game, and it wasn't, obviously he wasn't just like being a lights out scorer. He was just all over the place. And I mean, it was almost felt like they were like sneaky fouls that he picked up because I think I looked at it and I was like, oh, he has 4 fouls. That's kind of crazy. But I mean, he was like doing a lot out there, which I want to say like the past like 5-6 games, I almost have forgotten about him.
Yeah. And those key bench players that you're talking about, I mean, even like, I like that you bring up Kurt Jones, because even though he hasn't been really shooting well, he has developed into, he's kind of always been like this, but like one of the better defensive players on the team. Mm-hmm. And I thought that, we were just going to be getting him as a 3-point shooter, and I welcome that. But then when his 3-point shooting wasn't great, I criticized it. But I see how great he is defensively. And I think when you really look at it, there's no like bad defensive player on this team. And I think that's really, again, what kind of fed into them getting up in the first half and has like launched them. And I mean, I think they're like top 10 in the net for like offensive defensive rating. I don't know. I keep seeing some stats like that on Twitter, but they're one of the best defensive teams in the country, and you can see that through every player on the team.
Yeah. And I kind of want to get on my soapbox about Kurt for a bit, just because I was in the boat where, I think a lot of fans will look at his game and they'll see him go on these stretches where he's missing, like, obviously I think he went 0 for 3 against either Texas or Baylor. Mm-hmm. And then, obviously he starts the Kansas game 0 for 4 before hitting like 3 of his next 4 shots.
Yeah.
I mean, he goes on these stretches where, he doesn't hit the threes, and we're just seeing him taking threes. But if you look at what he does on the defensive end of the floor, he more than deserves the minutes, because I think it was the Kansas game where I was watching him pull up, break threes, and then I see him on the other end. I'm like, oh my gosh, he's hanging onto McCullough. He's not letting him move an inch. He probably is one of the best defensive players on this team.
Yeah.
And it just kind of sucks that obviously he doesn't have the scoring to go along that, but when he's out there, that the other team is probably going to have a lull in their offense.
And I think for, guys like us that criticize, we like to kind of put them in a box. Players like Kurt, mm-hmm. We kind of really just, and Texas, their game against Texas proved me wrong for sure, that you kind of really just have to trust that if guys are on the court on a TJ Ottsberger team,
they're on the court for a reason.
Yeah. They have their reasons that they're out there. They're not just, Kurt Jones is a shooter. That's not what it is. Kurt Jones is, can shoot the ball well in stretches, like you mm-hmm. said, but overall is a great defensive player. And I think that's, what TJ always thinks about, because they live off their defense, which fuels their offense. Talk about it a million times on this podcast, but I mean, credit to TJ though for just always building, these past 3 years, building a roster that is really sound defensively, which, like I said, is the reason they're not only in these games against like big rivals, especially on the road, but it's the reason they're winning these games.
Yeah, because I mean, I think the thing that people forget is that, I mean, you can have nights where you are not shooting the ball well, mm-hmm. and there's nothing you can do about it. It's just sometimes things are just not clicking, and you see some shots miss, and then all of a sudden all the shots are missing. But that doesn't happen on defense. Mm-hmm. You are going to be playing with the same intensity every single game. Mm-hmm. You're going to be out there and you're going to be playing the same high-level defense every single game. So I think he really has just pounded it home that defense is the way to win these games, to mm-hmm. compete in the Big 12, because even on the bad nights, Iowa State is still good defensively. I mean, it's very rare that they're bad. I mean, obviously you look at BYU, but really across this year, I don't think there's been another game where they've been bad defensively.
Right. And you even look at like the Texas game, Iowa State didn't particularly shoot the ball really well. 3-point mm-hmm. shooting, again, just doesn't really work out for them. There's no surprise. They haven't really, again, been a great 3-point shooting team this year. But overall, just, missed some shots, missed some layups. You could kind of tell that some guys were getting tired, which, I don't blame them because it's a really high intensity game. But, you look at a game like Houston where they beat them, but they only scored like 50 points. And kind of to what you were saying, and kind of put this all together is, you're not going to, shoot the ball really well every night. Mm-hmm. But, they won that game. They scored against Houston. They only scored I think it was 58 points, whatever it was, but they held Houston to low 50s, and which is a team that we now know can, score 70, 80 points a game. So again, kind of just put it all together. Iowa State defensively, when they're on top of it, they can be one of the best teams, I'll just say it, in the country when it comes to that. But it's all about translating it, and I think they did that really well against Texas. I mean, anything else you really want to go in depth about there?
I think my big thing with Texas is, like, Texas did go on a run there. They cut the lead, which, I mean, we've seen this happen with Iowa State, is they'll play some just kind of, I want to say, like, lazy minutes in a way where they've let teams come back.
Yep.
Usually they end up not letting them come back and win, but there's been some times where they have come back and just taken over the game.
Yeah.
Texas looked like they were going to do that. I mean, Dessou was hitting everything. And, I mean, obviously we've seen Dessou hit from deep in previous games, so it wasn't a surprise. But when Texas started clicking, I think the big thing for me was seeing Taman just get back to, like, his old self. Because I feel like ever since Taman's come back from his injury, he just hasn't really been playing the same. He has been, like, he's almost been playing safe. He hasn't been filling out the stat sheet. He hasn't been, running into the lane as much. He hasn't been just putting his body on the line. But against, like, Texas, like, he was the reason that they won that game.
Yeah, and you can look at Milan was the leading scorer with 13 points, which is crazy, and it credits your take on it being a full team effort. But in that second half, again, Taman really steps up. He forces a lot of turnovers. I want to say he had like 4 or 5 steals in that by the end of the game. And he has really the play of the game towards the end where he has Tyrese Hunter on him and he throws, he throws a sit or pass the ball right to Trey King for an easy dunk with, which credit to Trey King for making up for his missed layup earlier, because I was going to pull my hair out if they would have lost that game, because it looked like an easy dunk and he took a layup. And, I don't want to discredit him because I don't know what it's like to be 6'10", 6'11", however tall he is. I don't know how easy it is to dunk in a situation like that, but, made up for it. And just kind of like I said, Taman was making plays all over the place the second half.
Yeah, he wasn't just like scoring. He was finding people open, and he was, being smart with the ball. He was taking time off the clock, honestly, because they needed to run the clock out. And I mean, like, there was a lot of times where I was like, Taman needs to be the one to touch this ball or like take this shot. Like he was pretty much the manager of the end of that game.
Hits a big 3 too, I want to say.
Yeah,
so,
he had a 3 right before the missed layup and into the Trey King. He assisted Trey King on that dunk, which kind of put it away.
Yeah, and just kind of like what you were saying, that's probably his best game back from injury, and we kind of saw him just kind of struggling to kind of get back to what his game was, but thankfully, Kurt and Keyshawn step up, and they're playing, or at least Keyshawn is. He has to be. I'm going to say he's playing like one of the best guards in the Big 12, and has really impressed me for someone that was kind of again struggling at the beginning of Big 12 play, but I think he's been a great piece to this team. After I thought that his game, I didn't really know if his game was going to translate into conference play.
I always had high hopes for him. Just seeing him play like early on, I was like, okay, this guy's might be special.
Yeah, kind of like me with Pav.
A little bit.
A little bit.
I think, okay, the last thing I wanted, maybe like a little bit of tangent on the Texas game, just kind of wrap it up. I feel like you brought up missed layups. There was a lot of like just missed easy shots. I mean, we saw Rob Jones kind of brick a couple like from the cylinder. We saw quite a few blocked shots too. I mean, you're going up against a 7-foot guy. That's probably going to happen.
Yeah.
But Iowa State was able to grab offensive rebounds like crazy. And I think they won that game off of second chance buckets, which is pretty much what the commentators were saying the whole game.
And that's not something that they've done very well all season. Not only just second chance points, but offensive rebounds in general. So, we have been ones that have criticized Rob and Trey and Hassan, the forwards really in general, for not always being the great at rebounding, making those second chance opportunities, but they really kind of put it together, or at least I think Rob and Trey did. Hassan's had a little bit of a fouling problem the last couple of games, which kind of sucks to see because he's one of the most energetic and impactful players defensively and offensively when you can get him going. So, hopefully they could turn that around because I just love watching him play. But yeah, they won. That was like a really key part is getting those second chance points.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, you talk about Ward, obviously there's a couple guys that, they're a little bit hot and cold in the Big 12 play so far, but they have a big chance coming up against TCU where they're back home. They're not playing on the road this time, and they have Taman, and you're kind of hoping that some of these cold players will start getting hot.
And, at least none of the Iowa State starters didn't score 0 points. Texas can't really say that.
Yeah, sorry, Tyrese.
I criticized him a little bit, pretty heavily actually, going into the game. But just kind of thinking about Tyrese as a player, first of all, I think he is a great player. And it kind of sucks to see
he has
him.
His nights.
Yeah, and it sucks to see him leave Iowa State because as a sophomore, when I was a sophomore, and he came in and, is like one of the best freshmen in the league. I think he was all Big 12 freshman team. It was great. I thought he was going to be here for a while, and with Taman coming in, it was going to be a great tandem. But I don't blame him for wanting to go to Texas in the early stages of like NIL. But there hasn't been the greatest exchanges between him and the Iowa State team, especially on social media. But like you said, yeah, he does have his nights, and I actually always forget that he does have like a great story. Kind of, I don't know if you know, but I think both his mom and his dad passed away when he was young. So,
yeah. Actually, our old sports editor, Matt Bellinson, did a really good piece on Tyrese when he was coming here. So definitely a good read. Really humanizes him. Really makes you want to root for him. Which kind of further makes it seem like it sucks that he did leave because it would have been nice to see him in a Cyclone uniform for a bit. But I mean, Taman's kind of come in and proven that there's still a bright future at that position.
Yeah. And again, this will be the last thing about Tyrese too and I was losing my train of thought, but I wanted to say this is that also, I've heard from, people on social media, other podcasts that they haven't really Texas hasn't really done a great job using his strengths, and they've kind of asked him to be, this kind of like side piece when I really think he does flourish when he's one of like the main ball handlers on the team. So they haven't really done a great job with him, but that's not Iowa State. That's Texas.
It just doesn't really seem like he fits the way that they play that much. He's honestly not really a bench player, which is kind of crazy saying that just because of what he does when he's on the floor. But I mean, he really is good at, we saw it at Iowa State at just like managing a game and, being the leader, the point guard on the floor. And he doesn't really have that chance at Texas because, the team is just, they have better options. So,
and, Iowa State grabs that win. They have some time off now leading into, tomorrow's game against TCU, which is a team that they, beat pretty handily without Taman. Another second half collapse from what I remember that made it a really close game. But, when you force 27 turnovers, it kind of helps you out.
Yeah. Hey guys, it's Jacob Bryce, the producer and editor of this podcast. The mic's cut out during this portion, so we had to go with the on-camera audio. Sorry for the sound quality, but we got to work with what we have. Enjoy the rest of the pod.
Yeah, so this time around for Iowa State, I feel like they're in a much better position against TCU, not only because they have Lipsy, but because they're going to be playing at home, which, they can beat any team at home. We've seen it. So now they have to be asked to beat a team that they beat on the road at home.
Yeah, and I think this is one of those games where you kind of get, if you're an Iowa State fan, you kind of get scared because you've seen this in the past couple seasons where, Iowa State, they've come off some big wins and they drop some games at home or just in general, going on a losing streak, put that together. I wrote a column earlier this week. I don't think that's going to happen, especially against this TCU team that, has looked impressive the last couple weeks. And, they beat, I think they beat Texas, I was looking for, and they got into a pretty heated game with Baylor, I want to say too. But other than that, I mean, yeah, they're just gonna have to replicate the same things that they did on the road, which was forcing a lot of turnovers. Even without Taman Lipsey, they were really good defensively. They shot the ball really well in the first half. Second half, again, one of those second half slides that Iowa State's been accustomed to. But you talk about what they need to do is really just prove that they can keep winning at home and stay undefeated there.
Yeah, and you talk about replicating the last TCU game. That might be a little difficult just because of record-breaking turnover numbers that TCU hasn't seen in over 20 years and Iowa State has never seen in Big 12 play. But I mean, you have Taman back. Curtis Jones showed that he can. I mean, he would have tied the old record for steals. That's something he had. And then you have Keyshawn too. These three guys that they've stepped up in the past. I mean, Keyshawn and Kurt really stepped up against TCU in the last matchup, and now they have Taman. Which I mean, I told you what Taman said at media today. I mean, he said they haven't played against me yet, so
which
that's a good confidence.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah,
that's pretty cool, Taman. But and I think they're also just missing playing at home. I mean, we haven't been able to watch them play in person for a really long time, and it's kind of difficult watching them on the TV, really trying to get a full analysis of how they play. Yeah. But they probably miss playing at home just as much as we do. And like I said, that's a place that they're undefeated at this time, or at this point in the year. And I think I'm gonna predict another Iowa State win over TCU. I think this is one of those where they shouldn't think too much about it. It's again, TCU's coming in as a better team than when Iowa State played them on the road. But I think overall, kind of how it was in that first TCU game is that Iowa State is just a better team that will end up winning.
Yeah, and I think the big thing for me is Iowa State was really on top of TCU the last time they played. And TCU was able to come back and, obviously you look at the score, they won by 1 point. Really it was like a 4-point win because, a buzzer beater 3 that was just tossed up, cuts the lead to 1. But, I mean, they still let up a pretty large comeback.
Yeah.
And, I mean, I feel like that isn't going to happen at Hilton.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like the crowd plays such a role into momentum of games that since it was on the road, it was at TCU, the fans were involved, they were getting into it. Every shot that TCU hit had that much more momentum onto it. So if Iowa State finds themselves with a lead, I feel like they will keep that lead throughout as opposed to letting up a little bit too much breathing room.
Yeah, and although, we've talked about these second half stutters that they've had, and they've had those at Hilton, I think really just being at home, obviously for TCU in the last matchup, played in their favor. I mean, they scored 40 points in the second half after Iowa State also scored 40 points in the first half. Pretty similar halves in general, but Iowa State hasn't let up. I want to say there's probably only once, maybe twice in Big 12 play at home where Iowa State has let up 40 points and a half.
Yeah.
So, I don't think that's something that this is probably going to be a game that's decided by more than just 1 point like it was last time. And I think that home environment that Iowa State's been missing, they're really going to welcome it, even though they're obviously splitting this last road series. But I think the fans are ready for them to be back home, and that atmosphere is going to be popping. And it's weird for me because I don't really usually like to rely on Hilton Magic, where a lot of narratives that have been pushed about that. But I think it really is that they just miss playing at home, and they're going to show out for this home crowd.
Yeah, I mean they've showed out in the past in front of a home crowd. And I mean the big thing I think that I want to see is. Yeah, obviously I want to see how Taman plays against TCU, but I also want to see if Keyshawn can kind of bounce back from kind of a quiet game against Texas, and I want to see if Kurt can obviously kind of replicate some of what he did, but although he isn't going to be starting this time around.
Yeah, and in that Texas game where we talked about it was a team effort, it was almost kind of a good thing because you could tell that Texas wasn't going to let someone just take over like Keyshawn or Taman. I mean, Taman did late in that second half defensively, but offensively, Texas wasn't going to allow anyone from Iowa State to take over. I do see that probably happening again, though, with TCU as they let we talked about it, guys who coming into the game, Keyshawn was coming off a good game against BYU, but outside of that, him and Kurt, not really great games, and or games before then, and they combined for, I want to say, 37 points against TCU on the road. So I think they're just going to probably not replicate that exactly, but I see the guards playing a big factor in this game, kind of like how they did in their last matchup with TCU.
Yeah, and I think that kind of came down to the fact that obviously the bigs were in foul trouble. You look at Robert Jones and Hassan Ward each having 4 fouls at the end there, which was a big reason as to why TCU was able to come back. Is because Iowa State didn't really have the paint presence they had in the first half.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like once they're at Hilton, the calls should start going their way, as we've seen in the past. So you're thinking that maybe Hassan, maybe Rob can stay out of foul trouble this time around, and then just see what they can do at home.
I think overall this is just a game that Iowa State, not really a prove-it game in terms of I think they proved that they are a contender, but I would say it's all just about maintaining. You're at home. It's a sad early tip, pretty kind of early-ish tip for TCU. So, or for Iowa State, they just gotta, get the job done, keep the ball rolling. Whatever metaphors you want to use for a team that is looking good despite losing against Baylor. But I think you guys got to put this game together and finish this. They're entering the second half of Big 12 play. And this is where you find out, how impactful you're really going to be in that Big 12 tournament come, early March.
Yeah. So, as you said best, Iowa State just has to get the job done, keep the ball rolling, and we will see if they can get it done against TCU. All we can do really is just wait. So, thanks everybody for watching, and we will be back next week with another episode of The Daily Dish.